Um, let's head down to, so yesterday was religion and education. Keep in mind, by the way, I wanted to remind you that you know, Oberlin College was not founded for women, but was like both desegregated. You can see African American lady here, and no gender separation later, which made it the only one of its type for a while. Talked about the Lyceum lectures, which are, you know, the TED Talks of the 1800s. The Quakers, please make sure again you recognize the role of the Quakers as being important to almost all these reform movements. Many of these folks were Quakers. So let's take a look today at women, the ladies, and really focus a lot on this concept of the cult of domesticity. Now, I want to point out the first thing that the book mentions is, in this man's world, is that a woman was subordinate. So subordinate means under the law, women were to depend on men for virtually everything. You understand? So women were not allowed to vote. Their status, the only time a woman was not actually under some male authority was if she was a single woman away from her father. So a great example of that would be Susan B. Anthony. But Susan B. Anthony lived with her father most of her life, or her father's house. So in other words, very, very hard to have any independent status. So you were like a child, even as a 40-year-old woman. You had to have your husband's signature on anything. Now, if you were single, you could own your own property. So that was your only option. But of course, no one wanted to be single. What was particularly interesting is that when you got married, your property then became your husband's, except for in some southern states. Like Virginia, that didn't happen. But Virginia was one of the few that didn't happen. Perhaps more noteworthy is that you could not start a divorce. Divorce was extraordinarily rare. And if a divorce happened, you had, as a lady, no chance of custody of your children. You understand? So you lost your kids in any sort of divorce proceeding, unless the state could prove, and they usually didn't try, domestic abuse, like genuinely prove it. Keep in mind, that was usually, in the eyes of law enforcement, something that families had to work out. This was not something that people got arrested for doing too. The book does talk, it makes a good point though, that there were far more crimes to protect women from violence here than in Europe. All right. For example, rape in the United States was a capital crime. They would execute you for that. So that's pretty serious. You know, that was better protection law here in America than it was in Europe. But what this means is, and please understand this, is women did not have legal rights. Not only the right to vote, but virtually all rights under the law. Now, they were citizens, but they were like children. Okay. Now, the place that they were expected to be was in the home, right? That was their sphere. And again, that meant that the male-dominated patriarchy saw that as a way to keep women away from all the awfulness of reality of life outside the home, protect you. Look at this pastor saying, a woman's power is her dependence. A woman who becomes a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural. So that's not consistently shared by all women. Keep in mind, who are a lot of our reformers are women. Okay. But many times, almost all these women are doing it through the prism of the church, particularly the Quakers. All right. So let's take a look at some of these women. So first of all, the women's rights movement was not just women. I like to point that out. Many of these women were supported by their husbands. A prime example would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You know, she had like 12 kids. All right, and her husband supported her efforts completely. But your first debate actually emerges in England. Now, keep in mind, there were women suffragettes, they were called, in England at the same time. And several of these middle-class women traveled to London as abolitionists. You understand? England had the world's sort of leading abolitionist group at the time. The former slave Olaudah Equiano had traveled to England and was preaching teaching like this. Here's a slave person who can, first of all, write a book. I've got Equiano's Travels back there. But as well as an educated former slave who, is a good symbol of what can be the fate of African Americans or African slave people. So they traveled all the way to London for this conference, this anti-slavery conference. And when they get there, women are seated separate from men. So women aren't able to participate in the conversation. All they can do is sit in like a balcony or in a side room and listen. And so several of these women get upset, most notably Lucretia Mott. So you need to know her name. She was a Quaker abolitionist who was angry over her treatment in England by men. I mean, like, what kind of reformer is it, sexist? So when she comes back, and by the way, these women live in the burned over district. Remember where that is? Yeah, Western New York, along the Erie Canal area, the area of religious reform. These Quakers come back, and she meets with a neighbor, another woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Cady is her maiden name. So she's married Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And these two women decide, let us create a conference, a meeting, just like the one that was in England, but instead we're going to make it for women, a women's rights conference, all right, which was unheard of, hadn't happened before. So right there in a small town on the Erie Canal, they sent out notifications. At this town called Seneca Falls, women would gather in the sort of massively important year of 1848. So much happened in the world in 1848, like a weird world year, but come to Seneca Falls, and at this meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott will be there and talk about the rights of women. So they show up, and here's one of the ads. You can see it's a convention to discuss civil and political rights, the discussion of something called the Woman's Party. So show up to Seneca Falls and meet here in 1848 in the summer, okay? And when they get there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton reads out loud this document. And this is part of the keystone of the whole event. And it's called the Declaration of Sentiments. So the Declaration of Sentiments is a replica of the Declaration of Independence, except where it says he, referencing King George III, Stanton is talking about men and mankind, male kind. And so if you read here, he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. That means the right to vote. He has never let her vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has had no voice. Okay? He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken her all right and property, even to her wages. So there's this long list of the history of mankind, of the injustices of men against women. And so this is a really inspirational moment. Now, Susan B. Anthony's not here, but she lives down the road. And so she finds out about it afterwards. She's like, I got to meet this thing. And they do. They get together and they form one of the greatest partnerships maybe in the history of our country. You understand? Because Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to be like she's really fascinating because she has all these children. Here she's pictured with one of them. And she was fun and vivacious, like not partier, but she was short and plump and cheerful. She's just kind of like the life of the party, right? Very much a interesting woman. She had her father, their only son had died. And so she had been raised to be sort of not like a man, but there was a lot. She tried to be like a man, like she wanted to do. So she was much more assertive. Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker. And so she was used to being sort of treated as an equal. Keep that in mind. Like the Quakers didn't discriminate in terms of gender. So these two women get together. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is not going to leave New York that often because she's got a whole brood of kids, right? She does a lot of writing and a lot of public speaking there in that area. But Susan B. Anthony is going to, I think about it, she wore a red, like a scarlet hooded cape. It's almost like Red Riding Hood, like it. And she would go everywhere across the country, just like a circuit rider. Susan B. Anthony went from town to town, and wherever she went, she would form women's rights groups. And so much so they became known as Susan B's, right? And people like townspeople would notice the red cape when it came into town. Oh no, it's Susan B. Anthony. She's going to rile up trouble, But she gave speech after speech after speech, and so she became sort of like the face of the women's rights movement. Now, keep in mind, she's not just championing the right to vote. She's championing changes in property rights, changing in the rights to divorce, particularly the rights to have your own income free from others. And she did, now she was single-mindedly devoted to her cause. It's not that she didn't have any attraction for men. In fact, at one point she was really close to, well, she was in a serious relationship with a man, and it didn't work out. But immediately she married herself to this cause. This would be her effort all the time, So she is going to go thousands and thousands of miles, particularly when trains come. People will attack her. But one of the things that's interesting about her, she didn't spend a lot of time talking about all the other reforms. What Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton recognize is that if you champion everything, it's kind of like you're championing nothing. You understand? Like if you're trying to reform everything, then like it's hard to. You got to focus a lot of your energy, and so they're going to focus their energy on women's rights primarily, and then they would do that by forming an organization. So you need to do that. Write this group down. They're going to become known in history as NALSA. It's easy way to remember. No, sir. NALSA. That's what it sounds. National Women Suffrage Association. Okay. Now, some of what they criticize is the idea of the cult of domesticity, but not much of that. In other words, these are not women that are saying women should leave the home. They're not arguing that. They're not saying, not what we would call third wave feminists. They're not saying that men and women should be totally equal. They're saying men and women should be equal. How? In terms of citizenship. In other words, they're not saying women should be factory workers. Not that. Women should be company owners. They're not talking about breaking the glass ceiling. They're not talking about equal pay for equal work, which is like modern feminists, right? They're saying that the basic rights that Americans have should extend to women. The basic civil rights that women should have should be equal to men. And today we're so like, that seems so alien to us that would be a thing. It's hard to imagine women out there championing it. But whenever I see, women, who say, I don't care about government, not related to me or politics, I just think, can't imagine what Susan B. Anthony would say. Like the idea that it's a separate men's sphere, politics or sciences or, anything like that, it's just preposterous. But that's what it was at the time. Okay. So no Mott as a Quaker, and Stanton, I just read here, she had 7 kids. Sorry, I didn't exaggerate her to 12. And again, that she particularly had a successful support network. So please know that they were critics of and they were the radicals of their day. They were critics of these sort of gender roles where men had all the power and women were disempowered. Okay? So know the Seneca Falls Convention particularly. And I love the cartoons from this period. So take a look at these cartoons. The fear of the opponents. There were many opponents of this. There were men who just did not believe in this at all. There were people who didn't believe in this, including women. They believed that what these women were trying to do, if women had their way, and there's even a cartoon in your textbook from Harper's, they argued that if women had their way, gender roles would be reversed. Men would be at home raising babies, and women would be out, driving chariots and cars. You understand? And that to them would have been, all of the isms I've ever learned about is governed by, as far as like discriminatory isms, is governed by fear of like the other group getting more than you get, getting better than you get. Right? It's what it's all about. It's fear. And so men were afraid, I believe. Now they used that language to validate it, biblical language or whatever. But what it really meant was a shift in power. Okay? It meant a shift in power. And they didn't want that because they felt like once you have power given up, you're never going to get it back. That's the argument. And many men were very much opposed to this. In fact, they were outright opposed. Usually they would follow Susan B. Anthony around and throw stuff at her. They would scream at her and yell at her and stuff like that. So we think today about Susan B. Anthony being on money and Susan B. Anthony being a household name. Like people don't realize that everything Susan B. Anthony wanted didn't happen at all in her lifetime. For 60 years, she championed these causes. 60 years. And died without any of it really coming to fruition. So, I think about kids and people quitting after their first failure, after the first time. This woman devoted her life to a cause that people mocked her whole life. You understand? And yet she was persistent. And yet nevertheless, she persisted, right? As one would say. So there is a list of women in your book that I'm going to give you. Here is another example. Here's Susan B. Anthony depicted in the cartoon. The celebrated man tamer, as she's called in this Harper's Weekly criticism. So here is another woman I'd like you to know. Now, I often don't talk about clothing that much in terms of as a statement. Because by and large, most of us dress like lower to middle class Americans. We don't have much fashion sense, in a sense that it's hard to afford. But one of the things that was really, really disliked by these women were the big hoop skirts. You guys know the hoop skirts? Actually, had this like wooden skirt around them. No, you're not familiar with the hoop. So it's like a series of, I'll see if I can't grab one right here. Yeah, like the birdcage thing. Yeah, exactly. It's like an exoskeleton or an internal skeleton. And so if you consider something like, I'll just post it. Something like this, you might imagine how uncomfortable this would be, right? I read a joke somewhere that said this was the 19th century way of social distancing. Yeah, because it's 3 feet from you. And if a woman's wearing one 3 feet, how far is it apart? That's crazy, right? Every woman in America should be wearing a hoop skirt. But heck, every man too, right? Yeah, no, just kidding. So the point is like Bloomer comes along and says, I'm going to dress more comfortably. And she wore Turkish pants from Turkey that were, blousy but comfortable. It's like kind of wearing sweatpants, And they became so popular that they're called in history bloomers. Women wore bloomers. And so I know it seems weird to wear pants, right? Like, who cares? Women wearing pants or not? You got jeans on, who cares, right? You would have been perceived just 70 years ago as extraordinarily unfeminine. Maybe less than that. All right, 50 years ago. And so if a woman wore bloomers in the 1850s, imagine how unfeminine that must have been, like in terms of the mindset of the men. So it was a statement. It was a statement saying, I'm not going to conform with the clothing of the day. Okay. Now, there are a couple others who I'd like you to note. I have them mentioned later in other slideshows, but Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, America's first female physician. So make sure you catch that name. I'll talk again when we talk about science. All right. A female physician. And then there are two women who are extraordinary in terms of what they do at the time that is really, really radical. These are two women who are banished by their family out of the South. These two ladies right here from Charleston, South Carolina, are extraordinarily Southern abolitionists. So let that sink in. Like, they're from Charleston, South Carolina, and they would go around on the Lyceum lectures and other ways of talking, and they would preach against slavery. And they grew up in slaveholding families. You understand? They were slaves, like people who were very knowledgeable of the slave business. And so I want you to know that Grimke, for whatever reason, your book just barely touches on them. So I better make sure it touches a little bit more. So these are the two abolitionist ladies who were thrown out of the South for their risk. Very, very rare to find Southern abolitionists, like just in general, much less Southern abolitionists from a slave-owning plantation family in South Carolina. So these two women were quite important for history, and I would know them as well. Good. So let's move now to this last major concept before art that we're going to do, and that is what else was emerging besides religious communities, and these are utopian communities. So you may be aware that around the same time period in history, Karl Marx is hanging out in London, right? Writing what? The Communist Manifesto. So Karl Marx and his ilk are considering communism. because of the injustices of the Industrial Revolution that perceived injustice, right? Well, what you start to see in America, of course, in this area, are religious communes, right? Initially, you find a commune is designated, is designed to step away from mainstream society, to withdraw from mainstream. I've got friends who live in communes now, okay? Religious communes. I've got a buddy of mine who actually I visited and stayed a couple of days with, who lives in a commune. Actually, I don't think he lives there anymore. I'll show you that commune after the lecture, or in a minute. But you also have, besides these religious communes, new utopian communes. All right, and what that means is an attempt to try to create a planned model society. If I did what I really wanted to do, I guess, like if I had whatever I could do, I would probably offer an elite academy with elite teachers for public school students who are eligible. I only really like teaching students who want to learn. I'm not here to be I'm too smart and too motivated to teach kids who aren't. Somebody else can do that job, right? So I would create a sort of utopian school. I believe some people's job is to make better out of already good. Like it's not that people, oh, you teach smart kids. How hard can that be? I'm like, well, it's hard to motivate smart kids, because they think they're already smart, right? So imagine living in a society where people are pretty, life's good. They're like, no, it's not nearly good enough. It needs to be better. Okay. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to make it better? Well, there was a couple different ways that this happened. So let's take a look at them. One is what we call a secular commune. So we've already looked at religious communes. Who can remember a religious commune? That's all right. We haven't really talked about that. I just wanted to guys, like, you know, the Mormons, they moved away because they couldn't live where? Where they were. Yeah, if they're in Illinois, they got attacked, right? But I think of like Plymouth as a utopian commune. You guys understand? It was a planned society, right? With a religious purpose. Well, these are secular communes. What does the word secular mean? Earthly, worldly. Worldly. So in the commune, which by the way, were fiercely independent-minded. So in other words, you would join the commune, but you were supposed to be self-reliant. Like that's what So it's like being an individual in a group. The problem with that is sometimes what do you need? Help. Yeah, and see, this is my dilemma as a public school teacher. I want this for you, but most of you have a hard time doing it without what? And so it's like finding the balance between, you're free to do whatever you want, okay? Which, for some people would be, oh yes, I will pursue my academic background regardless of how motivated or how much you teach me. Others are like, if I don't give you a daily quiz, you're never going to read. Right? It's human nature. So this is what these communes had to deal with. The problem is usually this part, well, you guys know the fundamental problem of communism? Well, you don't have to be perfect to create a better, yes, but that's the problem with anything. Give me more. What's the fundamental problem with communism? All right, not only think the same way, but work the same way. You guys ever done group work before? Even it's like the bell curve. Are y'all familiar with the bell curve? Yeah. Even in really smart classes that I teach year after year, there's a bell curve. Incomes, 3 or 4 F's, 3 or 4 A's, bunch of B's and C's. Don't matter. The only difference is this class is weighted, so thus you earn that curve movement, right? That's what's wrong with this inflationary stuff. Give everybody a bell curve on an inflated grade, and that makes everybody awesome, right? Problem is, not everybody shares the same work ethic. That's fair. I told my son, you better, if you don't give me 100, you better give me your best effort. If it wasn't 100, you understand? If it wasn't 100, it better be your best effort. Problem is, sometimes for most of you guys, 60% effort's enough. Right? That's fair. Hey, a lot of times in my life, 60% is what I put out. 42%. Because it's a what? It's enough. Well, these things, a lot of them needed 100% out of their workers, and they weren't going to get that, as they will see. So we'll start with Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a socialist from Britain, but he was a utopian socialist. not a quote scientific socialist like Marx. And he believed that the best way to fix the wrongdoings of industry is if all the workers own the factories together. So today we actually have businesses like this a little bit. They're called co-ops, cooperatives, okay? And that means the people who work in it all share the cost of the business. They're all stockholders, in essence, in the business. That makes sense? Thus, are they incentivized to see the business do well?
Yes.
Yes. So this works in premise, and I think it works on a small scale. Like if you got 8 brothers who are all running the same business, they might want to work hard, because they're all in a family business. Or 4 partners, that came out of college together. Problem is, this really was a neat idea. He tried it in Scotland, didn't work. It's called New Lanark in Scotland. So he comes over here and he sets it up. See? These nice communal housing, nice like farm, not farm, but greenery, like landscaping and all this. But in the end, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? So Brady, you see this thing that's really great where, there's 70 or 100 people that are working really hard together, and you can have a person who's like, I think I could get a lot out of that and not have to put a lot into it. So do some people arrive who aren't dedicated to it?
Yeah.
And they don't vote them off the island in time. You understand? The only way these communes are going to work, maybe not be perfect, but if everybody's giving 100%. My son and I are rewatching all 9 seasons of Walking Dead, right? Every time the group gains a new person, there's always this worry that that person is going to not add as much as they subtract. You understand? Well, New Harmony ended and people started subtracting more than people were what? I think the way the book describes it is little harmony prevailed. In addition to hardworking visionaries, there were also theorists who didn't want to do any work and scoundrels. The colony sank in confusion. So you're not going to create a utopian society where some of the people show up aren't committed to it. One of the reasons why years ago I quit doing the Beta Club was, you guys know what the Beta Club motto is? Awesome. Any of y'all in the Beta Club? Great. Yeah, even better. So the Beta Club motto is, let us lead by serving others. And what I discover with my students is, let us get something on our college recommendation and not have to serve it all. So I quit. Stop doing it. What good is a club when the people who are in the club don't believe in what the club is? That was my feeling. Now it may be different now. I don't know, but I didn't want to have a club with 100 members in it where 15 members were the only ones that cared about it. This is what we're doing in high school. We're teaching you guys literally to not appreciate the stuff you sign your name to. So no wonder we're taking a dump on our country, because we're trying to get you to say, I love America, but to believe it, right? Yeah. If you don't believe in it, what's the point? So these people had a problem. They had people join it that didn't what? Didn't believe in it, or if they believed in the benefit and not the work. And that's not useful, not for a commune, certainly. Either everybody, guys remember what happened with John Smith? Those who do not work, yeah, well, that's the kind of attitude you have to have with a lot of people. If I had my way with you guys, those who do not read, do not pass. You understand? Because that's the work that's necessary. All right, moving on. This one succeeds, partially because it's run like a dictatorship. All right, so you get that in there. But this is Oneida. The other reason Oneida works really, really well is because they actually manufacture something. In your home, you might have Oneida silver. Ask your mom when you go home one day, or your dad. I don't know, maybe that's how it works. Sorry, I'm being gender specific there. Ask your folks, do y'all have any Oneida silver? See if they've ever heard of it. This company in New York, and it was a company. You hear that? It was a commune. By the way, this thing never could quite manufacture much. This thing made really, really excellent silverware and traps, animal traps, right? Metal traps. So they had a business. So that's one reason it worked well. But take a read of what's up here. So a lot of these communes were millenarianists. And what millenarianists believe is, I don't have my little, I thought I had a thing up there about that. My bad. They believe that Jesus has already come. A millenarian believes that. You might, if you've read the New Testament, Jesus on his ascension into heaven said, before that he says, "I will come again." Kind of. A lot of Christians are waiting for what's called the second coming, okay, of Christ. Well, these guys, and then they weren't alone. There were other groups like them who believed that had already happened. And so, according to Revelation, after Jesus comes, there's like 1,000 years where the world will be a better place. Okay. And then at the end of that, so to speak, because Jesus is supposed to reign. And then at the end of that, you have like the end of the earth. The earth is destroyed, reborn. So I don't get all the details because it's complicated. Point is that's what these guys believe. So they thought that the old rules were kind of out. Jesus come and gone, old rules are gone. Okay, we can do what we want to do now, right? So they practice what we would call then free love. This is not unusual with cultish groups, where the leaders get to have sex with every woman in the group. This is one of those groups. So this man, okay, John Noyes, could basically hook up with every woman there. But they also would allow men and women to hook up with other men and women. Free love, you understand what I mean? Like non-traditional, complex marriage, I think is what the book calls it. So they practiced, these are like hippies of their day, right? They practiced free love. But, because again, they are all married to each other in the commune. But they also practice something that I always have found interesting, and that is a form of eugenics. Now, I don't want to get too gross on you, but your book, I think, still explains it. What kind of eugenics am I talking about here? Well, if you read in here, awkward talk, but still important. They practiced birth control through coitus reservatus. And the selection of spouses to have children together. So you guys know what eugenics are? Handsome or tall or smart marries or has babies with handsome, tall, and smart. So what coitus reservatus means, well, you could probably put the words together. Coitus is the Latin word for sex. Reservatus means is to withhold. So they're not withholding sex, but they didn't have birth control method, like prophylactics. They didn't have condoms, they didn't have stuff like that. So this is like the method of not finishing while still in the act. Reserving. Okay, I guess it's the most less graphic I can be. All right, so they actually had a system down where men weren't allowed to impregnate women. So they had to do this method, which, by the way, is not fail-safe. I'm going to go ahead and put that out there, not fail-safe. All right, you should know that by now. But nonetheless, they were quite successful. People came and hung out with them. They made money, and Oneida, the company of Oneida, still exists now. The Free Love Commune doesn't exist anymore, but this thing would last for like 2 generations. I don't think it stopped till after the Civil War. So another one of these free love groups, or another one of these communes, right? This one is also in the burned over district in New York. This next group is a religious commune, and they are the almost exact opposite. While they did make stuff, they made really simple, awesome stuff. I have one of these ladder back chairs in my house. All right. You probably see these ladder backs, right? The Shakers live very Spartan. You guys know the word Spartan as an adjective? Today, Spartan is called minimalism. Very, very little amount of stuff. And the Shakers were a religious commune, a religious group. They were around the country. And they were devout Christians who were celibate. Didn't have sex at all. They had no children. All right, think about that. Like, they didn't have sex because they became like Christian non-Catholic communities that lived together and harmonized together. They danced. That's a Shaker dance right there. They sang to the gift to be simple and free, right? But they didn't have children. So what's remarkable about this story is that they lasted for over 100 years because people still joined them. Keep in mind, this is before, on a large scale, Americans became of Eastern philosophies. Now, some Americans were familiar with it. You guys know what I mean when I say Eastern philosophies? So Americans didn't know about Buddhism. They didn't know about monasticism besides the Catholic Church. You guys know monasticism, like living in a monastery. So for the Shakers, they were creating a religious community based on the principles of Jesus, and they chose not to have children, not to have sex, and try to live very minimalistically, I guess the best way to put it. And it has a huge appeal, particularly during the Industrial Revolution when the country is getting so complicated, right? I think there will be already I see it in architecture, I see it in culture. There is going to be, in your lifetime, a strong trend to having less. You understand? You're going to go through a material phase. We always do. Material, material, material. And then there's going to be this simplicity is so much easier on the brain. Because as one guy writes in a book, the things you own end up owning you, right? So the Shakers focused on Christianity and less on materialism. And that's one of the reasons they had a big draw. For Mother Ann Lee, the founder of the Shakers, she was English. She was an immigrant. Mother Ann Lee comes here with this belief. And they do very well. And like I said, they attract thousands of people. But obviously hard to keep a thing going forever if you don't have babies, right? So Oneida and the Shakers. So let's move then into this other area of science, okay? So I told you so far, what kind of science classes were most classes, so to speak, up until this point? If you were going to take a time warp back to the 1830s, and you were going to learn how to be scientific, skilled, trained, what type of training or science would you probably be doing, you think? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Mechanical engineering, right? Mechanics. You would be doing things with plows, things with harvesters, things with machinery. So, I tend to compare it to like Votech-y kind of science initially, right? But there were some sort of gov school sciences, if I can call it like that, all right? And by that, I mean these sort of applied sciences. And they're rare, but they did exist. And I wanted to give you the two names that I want you to know, only two out of this group. So you had Professor Silliman, and that's an interesting name. He's the first to teach chemistry in America, and he taught at Yale. So Yale began to move away from just religious teaching, okay? Your other one I really find fascinating, and he's an immigrant from France. He taught natural science. Now, I know that sounds weird, but before the word evolution existed, he taught what would be ultimately that type of knowledge. So let's call it biology. Leave it at that. And probably I think it's his greatest pupil, Dr. Agassiz, was a guy named Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to be a naturalist because of his experience at Harvard. So these guys were at the prestigious schools. I think I have Asa Gray on there, who was also at Harvard, another scientist. So the point is that you started to see at a handful of universities research sciences, not just applied mechanical sciences, okay? But they were still very rare. It was seen as sort of a pursuit of, I guess you would say like a non-productive pursuit. Like, where does this get you? That kind of thing, okay? Now, this guy we're going to come back to a couple times in this country because he is an interesting figure. I've had to explain to students for years how you can be both a naturalist and shoot animals. Students who aren't hunters. So he wanted to catalog all the American bird species. And he almost succeeded. He got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. But not only did he shoot them, birds, he painted them in a wonderful manner, a beautiful manner. His Birds of America book, which is, here's a copy of it you see on the right side there, had hundreds of bird species depicted in beautiful art. All right, and today when you go to American museums, the American Museum of Art, be it New York or Richmond, you'll see Audubon prints there because he was our first sort of bird lover, right, and the extraordinary bird species in our country. Today there is an organization named after him, which is a naturalist organization to preserve birds, and they're called the Audubon Society. So that's still something that exists. So I would know John J. Audubon as a scientist. Okay, and as a naturalist, and a naturalist means somebody who spends their time in nature and enjoys and loves nature. So you can be a hunter and a naturalist. You don't have to dislike nature to kill animals. You understand? Now, if you want to kill all the buffalo, I would say you're definitely not a naturalist, right? You have no concern about the impact of what you do. All right. So yeah, that's Audubon. He's in the book as well. But I think the thing that I really enjoyed talking about, or at least looking at as far as science, was the medicine of their day. So medicine was disastrously bad, right? I think I forget if it's this book or not. Let me see if it's this book. One of the doctors, Oliver Wendell Holmes, says that if you threw all the nation's medicines into the sea, then the people would be better off and the fish would be worse, right? So this is what he's talking about. You can tell what the major content of these are. So cocaine, opium, cannabis, right? So in other words, what were most medicines? They were just narcotics. You're like, oh, I feel better. Oh, of course you feel better. You just took heroin. All right, so you had this really bizarre period of time where drugs were completely unregulated. There are no laws against this. Alcohol only in Maine, right? The Maine law. But so what people would often do, laudanum. You guys heard of laudanum? Liquid cocaine. So people would just buy bottles of this stuff, dilute it some, and then go out on the frontier and sell it. They became known as snake oil salesmen, But in some cases, they're selling liquid cocaine at a strong enough level, people became highly addicted to it. Important people in the industry. Keep in mind, this is about the exact same time that China is invaded by Britain to force them to buy opium, the Opium War. You guys familiar with the Opium War? So the opium from Europe and China is starting to flow into America too. So you think we have an opioid epidemic now, right? And we do. I mean, we have an opioid epidemic. But at that time in history, practically everybody's idea of medicine was hard drugs, that were available. And you'll see that, look at Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes. Now, the cigarettes didn't exist, and I got this picture from a little bit later. But you're going to have, in the 1930s and 40s, advertisement for cigarettes from your dentist and from your doctor. Your doctor recommends Newports or, Marlboros. Just the thought of how little we knew about public health back then. Same thing with the cracker diets. And so we were going through all this experimentation. I guess that would be the best word for it. Experimentation in every kind of thing. And that means it's hard to put a finger on what Americans were doing, because if you were on the frontier, you might be taking this, you might be having the Sylvester Graham diet. Probably not. Usually it's the middle class that had that kind of stuff, right? Okay. All right. We have time to go a little bit further, maybe all the way. That's my hope, to get finished really today. So, but first off, let's talk about art in this section. And I have a former student who is working on his PhD at Yale in architecture. Great kid. And we like to talk about architecture whenever I get together with him. But we always, when he was a student, we talked about how the first phase of architecture in American history was utterly derivative. So if that doesn't make sense, utterly derived from somewhere else. So of all the art in America in the 1840s, architecture was the least original. It's beautiful, it's gorgeous. I love the architecture of the period, but it's completely an imitation art. Even Monticello is a direct imitation of a Palladio villa, a villa in Italy made by Palladio, just a straight up duplication of it. So other art we're going to look at in a minute was creative and original, not so much this. But we still should look at it. So this is the architecture of the period. And it was, like I said, from Europe. You have three styles. I'm going to focus on two of them today. The other will come later. But the first is called the Federal style. That looks like pretty much a Greek building, doesn't it? Yeah. Or a Roman building, if you're into that. So we call Greek and Roman today neoclassical, right? New classical. But the classical styles of Greece and Rome were the inspiration for the new capital of America, for example. Remember, Washington, D.C. gets burned to the ground in 1812, or 1814, the War of 1812. So afterwards, the buildings that you're familiar with in D.C. are all built, not the original buildings, are built with what style? That's why it's called that. The Federal style, because that's the capital, So you have customs houses in that style. Jefferson's constructions are in that style, Italian, right? Beautiful rotunda. I mentioned Monticello. Here's the inside of the Capitol Dome, very much like the Pantheon in Rome, very much like Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral, which is inspired by all the Duomo and Florence. So very much like an Italian or a Greek building from the 3rd century or the 1st century. Okay, so that's this first part. Federal and Greek revival. This means lots of pillars, lots of columns, lots of, it looks like something out of Greece or Rome. But where Americans began to become original was in visual art, painting. So here is the first art, and we call it a school of art. What confuses students who haven't had any art at all is when you call something a school of art, it doesn't literally mean like a place to go to look at. So in other words, there is no building called the Hudson River School, like there's a building called Tunstall High School. So it's a school of art, if that makes sense. It's like a style of art, a group of artists. And the first really important American artistic movement is called the Hudson River School. So you can take a wild guess at where these artists were located. Yeah, right, along Hudson River of New York, right? So these are upstate New York artists. You're going to notice that these are going to be these sort of contemporaries of the naturalists that are writers. So in America, we're going to have a group of writers in a few minutes you're going to look at called the Transcendentalists. Over in England, they're going to have a group of writers called the Romantics. And you're going to have a group of painters called the Romantics. So this is like the Romantics of America. So what do they romanticize? They romanticize nature. Nature. No more portraits. Well, not no more, but not as many portraits. Portraiture still exists, but it's the same type of portrait. So Gilbert Stuart and Trumbull and Peale, those guys. But they focused on the majesty of America's spectacular nature. So these are mammoth landscape portraits, or not portraits, paintings, mammoth landscape paintings. They would go to nature for their inspiration. They were the visual of what the Transcendentalists were the literary. So this is a naturalist phase. It is during the era of good feelings. All right. And so a period in history where Americans were proud of our country. One of the things we were proud of was its natural bounty. You understand? Like we love that our country was the most beautiful country in the world. I still love it. I love America. Like it's land. I mean, I'm a physical fan of America. So painting was a way to express this idea of how we were all part of one big oversoul, which is a transcendental idea. Okay? So you'll see this frequently. They're giant landscapes, vistas, big scenes. People that are in them are usually tiny or almost non-consequential. If you've ever stood in the Grand Canyon or in Yosemite, you kind of feel small, right? You know, I mean, like, big, I'm little. All right, they would be some of the first to experiment with optics. They're called the luminists, the later ones. They're called the luminists because of the luminescence of the paint they use. And you'll often see a broken tree either in the foreground or the back, like side of the painting. Okay, so the most important Hudson River School painters we're going to look at in just a minute. Things they usually would look at: transcendentalism in the West a lot. Our nation, what does it mean to be American? All right, they would often depict Native Americans either racistly or criticism of racistly, depending on who the artist was, right? And they were pretty much anti-civilization, anti-buildings, and anti-cities, definitely that. So here's Thomas Dowdy's one of his paintings. You can see a little man, giant. You know, this light here is washing it out a little bit, but you get the idea of here's man in scale. Here's the background on the Hudson River. Okay. Here's the extraordinary, beautiful Niagara Falls. You can imagine what first Europeanized American descendants looking at this thing would have thought, right? And if you see it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it glows. It's so big and it's majestic. This one's there too in the Met. This is the Oxbow, and this is the one painter I want you to know by name of the Hudson River School. This is Thomas Cole, and Thomas Cole is one of America's great painters. All these guys are great, but most of the guys. But he's the one that's most familiar to people who study this period of art. Thomas Cole. So here you see a storm on the frontier, right? The Oxbow River being formed. Mount Holyoke is the college we've already mentioned. And this is his greatest painting series. It's called The Course of Empire. It's 5 paintings. Now I want you to look at the date. America hasn't even taken half of Mexico yet. Okay? Certainly hadn't taken California yet. And yet he's already calling America the what? Empire. Now, Jefferson had called us an empire of liberty. All right, so his initial Course of Empire depicts America in what state? Savage, meaning before who arrived? White people, right? Then along comes Jeffersonian view. White people living in harmony, right? Pastoral state, very little disruption to nature. Got a nice little house here in the background, right? So this is, we kind of coexisted with nature, he said, peacefully. Then comes what? Well, the empire itself. That's what consummate the marriage. The government, yes, but not just. I mean, society. It's so much more than government, right? It's the ascendancy of modernity and civilization and all its majesty, right? The big city. Then what? It's destruction, and then back to nature, right? A band that I listen to called the Talking Heads has a song about turning all the parking lots into flowers. Like, have you ever seen? There's a Will Smith movie called I Am Legend where he's like in New York and there's no one else there. Yeah, the post-apocalypse or whatever. Got some virus. But there is a lot of folks who think that. Have you ever been somewhere where nature has recovered what people have created? Weird, isn't it? Like a ghost town. So what he's saying is that America is going to become an awesome empire, right? Like when else? Who else went from republic to empire? By the way, he traveled to Italy. Rome. Yeah, Rome went from republic, right? Supposed to be nice, to empire. Decadence led to destruction, then abandonment. So the prediction of the collapse of America has been predicted for a long time. I don't always believe it because every generation has a chance to learn that we can make steps and not let it happen, right? Or at least prolong it, keep it going off to the future. We don't want to be like Rome. We don't want to be like the people who only lasted 2 centuries and then they collapsed. Rome lasted what, 5? Here's Asher Durand, another one. You can see here him depicting naturalists hiking in the woods. I was in the beautiful natural bridge this weekend, but it wasn't really in pristine nature because it was concrete paved, but it was still great to be there with my kids and look at it and think about what it must have. I said, what must have been like when Thomas Jefferson owned it. He did own it. George Washington surveyed it, and so like there was no pavement, no nothing. I can't imagine what the Native Americans was like. Great. So beautiful place. Okay. I mentioned now these are not part of the Hudson River School. You mind these other guys that I mentioned are all like upstate New York, but these were at the same time, and they painted, as you can see, these gorgeous seascapes. A lot of them. So the Luminists are focusing on visual, like luminescence, using oil painting to make it jump off the canvas, right? See here, and a lot of them are in New England. Okay. By the way, where do you not see any place mentioned at all in this grouping? Missing. What area of the country is missing? Bierstadt, who's an immigrant. Bierstadt is a really fascinating guy. We have one of his beautiful. He's out there in the Rockies. No Southern art. No Southern painting. One critic in the 1890s is going to call the South the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts. Beaux-Arts, French, beautiful art, and we're a desert, he said. So in other words, these are immigrants and people who went to art school or just learned to be artists in the North, but you don't really see much of this in the South, sadly. I've looked for Southern art just to show people what it looked like. There's some, but it's mostly sketchbooks like Jefferson's, and paint, big canvases and stuff like that. Now, one of the things that emerges during this period is by this guy. This kind of odd-looking fellow here. This is Louis Daguerre. And long before there were photographs, there were daguerreotypes, and these emerged by the 1860s. So what a daguerreotype was, have you ever seen the dudes with like they have like a drape over their head and they're holding up a stick and they're looking through a little, that's these. So they're actually pictures on metal and glass. So if you drop these things, they'll break. All right, because it's like I can't explain how the daguerreotype actually works, like the machinery of it. But that is a photograph, but it was not on print paper. It's on metal, or it's a tintype, or on glass. So it's called a daguerreotype. That's our first photograph. And then you also have the reproduction of high quality prints that are then mass manufactured by a company called Currier and Ives. Currier and Ives made what are called lithographs. So you could go in people's house, they're like posters, kind of. You could go in people's houses and there would be these really lovely pictures on the wall, often framed, and they weren't paintings, they were what? Lithographs. So this is an industry too that emerged during this period. Now there was something that was popular in the South, sort of, but it was popularized from the South. And I do want to talk about this because it has particularly impact on American culture today. So that is what is called the minstrel show. See how it's spelled? So the minstrel show was actually popular throughout the country. But one of the things that's interesting to me about cultural history of America is that there are certain things that are in the past that are considered inappropriate for white people to do. Types of singing, types of dancing. But black people do. So what white people would do is to decorate themselves like black people and then dance that way or sing that way. You understand? Not necessarily to mock black people, although they also did that. This is one of the reasons why it's absolutely, this is what we call blackface, and governor of the state got in trouble for doing this as some sort of joke or something in college. And then other people have done, and I'm like, I'm not sure that some people didn't get the memo when I was a kid growing up that you're not supposed to do this. Like this is not appropriate behavior, but it was not always meant to be overtly racist in a sense of critical, but much of it was. In other words, like they were mocking black people. Okay, or depending on what the performance was, they were doing music or shows that white people weren't supposed to do, but were allowed to do in blackface. So this becomes known as the minstrel show. One of the most famous minstrel shows in the late 19th century, one of the characters will be named Jim Crow. And so that is where that phrase is born. Okay, now the other is this fellow. Now he's interesting to me because a lot of his music is used in minstrel shows. Stephen Foster. He was, I can't say for certain that he was racist. I mean, keep in mind, most Americans that were white people pre-Civil War certainly were of that mindset. But the music that he created was so popular. Many people consider him the first, famous American musician, like rock and roll and country and bluegrass and jazz and blues. And now, obviously, people were singing. But his songs, like Camp Down Races and stuff like that, became so common that the Stephen Foster like if you listen to the Stephen Foster songbook, it is the music of the antebellum America. So it's hard, I mean, a lot of Americans would have listened to it. Keep in mind, there's no albums at that time. Of course, there are no CDs or anything like that. So if you heard music, it was live. Understand? And so it was Foster's music that were often utilized in what? Minstrel shows, much of which then becomes associated with the bigotry of blackface. But it was not necessarily his intent for the songs that he wrote to be associated directly with blackface. If you understand, it's just that's how they were performed often. So we have this correlation here of the minstrel show and blackface. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm not going to make it through to the end because I have a whole thing with transcendentalism, but it looks like that's just about it. So we'll finish up after the break. You have no added homework, no extra assignments. I want you to enjoy your Thanksgiving. Be grateful that you're healthy and that your families are healthy, I hope. And I'm going to stop recording here, see if there's any last minute questions.